Welcome to Business and Human Rights with Rochelle. I've worked in the intersection of business and human rights for nearly 3 decades, and I'm using this podcast to bring you relevant weekly news and in-depth discussion of critical issues. My focus has been the global supply chain across sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and extractives. I've done fieldwork in over 100 countries and hope to bring my insight and experience as a practitioner to this podcast. Thanks for joining me. Today is April 24th, 2023. It is the 10-year anniversary of the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh. To mark that historic event, we're speaking with Avedis Seferian, President and CEO at WRAP, Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production. But first, here's a highlight of recent news. In California, brands including Nordstrom and Neiman Marcus were said to buy clothes from a sweatshop that paid just $1.58 an hour. A U.S. Department of Labor survey of Southern California garment sewing contractors found workers are subject to wage theft and illegal pay practices. Based on data from more than 50 contractors and manufacturers, the 2022 Southern California Garment Survey found violations of the U.S. Fair Labor Standards Act in 80% of investigations. More than 50% of the time, employers illegally paid workers off the books, with payroll records forged or not provided. A report from NPR highlights the dichotomy in U.S. law and labor practices, where 12-year-olds are not old enough to buy cigarettes but can legally work in tobacco fields. The article highlights that the low-paying, difficult, dangerous work is legal for children for an unlimited number of hours as long as it is outside school hours. This is because U.S. child labor laws are more lenient in agriculture than in other industries, and efforts to change that have failed, leaving growers and companies to set the bar higher than what is legally required. The Guardian reported on Nepalese workers who migrate overseas to work. Every year, about 1,000 migrant workers from Nepal die abroad, mostly in the Gulf region and Malaysia. Some die due to workplace accidents or health conditions, but 12% of deaths have been recorded as suicide. According to the article, families are often shocked when this occurs. Some accounts link suicide to the huge debts that migrants take on to pay recruiters, often illegal fees. One worker took on $4,000 US in debt. Then his Kuwaiti employer paid him less than the amount promised in his contract, along with unexplained deductions from his salary. When he protested, a supervisor took his passport, leaving him no way out. In the cocoa industry in West Africa, efforts to pay a living wage or living income differential have been criticized after reports indicated the LID has not been paid to an estimated 1/3 of cocoa farmers. Experts noted that surpluses have kept cocoa cheap globally, and chocolate companies, global commodity buyers, and intermediaries seek to protect their margins. They cited inherent flaws in the government program, including a lack of supply management. Cocoa traders said they negotiate down the country premium to avoid steep losses because chocolate makers are not paying enough to cover the premiums. A Vice World News investigation in the UK found migrant workers on UK farms living in squalid conditions, including with leaking pipes, mice, and moldy, cold, and uninsulated camper vans. Workers reported sleeping in living rooms, beds too small to roll over in, or being forced to share a bed with a stranger. Some women reported being forced to share a camper with men with no way to lock their bedrooms and feeling unsafe and exposed. Grocery brands responded that they were reviewing claims. As I mentioned before, this is the 10-year anniversary of the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, and as brief background, Rana Plaza was an 8-story commercial building that housed shops, a bank, and as many as 5 different garment factories. When it collapsed, over 1,100 lives were lost and 2,500 people were injured. It was an immense tragedy, the worst industrial accident in Bangladesh. And I've invited Avedis Seferian to speak to me today. He is the president and CEO at WRAP, and also the current chair of the executive board of APSCA, which is the Association of Professional Social Compliance Auditors. WRAP has a long history working in the garment sector in Bangladesh, and I know Avedis in particular has many years of experience on the ground there. And so Avedis, thank you for joining me today. I'm really grateful for you taking the time. To get started, what can you tell us about some ways that the industry responded to this tragedy or was pressured to respond to the collapse.
Sure. Well, there are a sort of range of ways to respond to that, right? Uh, the immediate sort of humanitarian outpouring was very quick and also really spoke to the tremendous resilience of the Bangladeshi people. As you know, I have an office in Dhaka, and my local staff were able to participate themselves in person and be witnesses to how quickly the community rallied and how much, again, local outpouring of help there was, followed very shortly, just immediately thereafter by international aid and help and again an outpouring of support. So that's kind of the immediate reaction to the fact that so many innocent lives were lost. Um, Not too long after that, the bigger, sort of longer term reactions started to take place, and the obvious ones that we all know and speak of, even now, 10 years later, was the establishment of the Accord and the Alliance, two sort of uh, gatherings of supply chain actors that took it upon themselves to set and follow up on safety standards, whether it had to do with sort of building structure or fire or electrical, just sort of engineering standards. And the industry has tremendously benefited from the work of both these entities. The alliance, as you know, was largely led by sort of American buyers, brands and retailers, while the Accord was primarily based out of Europe. But they did a lot of work together and a lot of work amongst them, addressing really the vast majority of the exporting units in the Bangladesh garment sector. So that would be the sort of next layer of reaction. And then the Bangladeshi government itself, of course, also stepped up and uh, passed new legislation. They developed, with the help of those organizations, a new building code, implemented that, and then set up their own initiative that has now, with the coming to an end of the mandates of the Accord and the Alliance, essentially taken over the functions of those entities that really have created in Bangladesh, in some ways, a very unique set of circumstances now where today you've got a very robust ecosystem of being able to validate the physical and social safety of factories in Bangladesh through the engineering reports, the DEA's detailed engineering assessments, as well as obviously the underground work done by all the various social certification and social audit programs that have such a strong presence in Bangladesh these days.
That's just so encouraging to hear. It really reminds me that recently in March we had, a 100 plus year anniversary of the U.S. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, in which 100 and something workers perished in like 1911. But the outcome of that tragedy was the galvanization of legislation that hadn't existed in the US, including our labor code, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act, and just safety efforts, to improve safety of what were a lot of sweatshops around the country. So in a way, it just seems similar that this incredible tragedy galvanized action that's creating improvements for everyone else in this like fall on effect. Are you hopeful then that we've seen actual improvement over the last 10 years in Bangladesh?
Yes, I can certainly answer that last question with an unequivocal yes. We've definitely seen tremendous improvement in Bangladesh, and I'm really hoping that some of that is going to translate to other destinations as well. It is very sad, and unfortunately, throughout human history, a recurring feature, right, of the human condition, that it often takes something of such magnitude or tragedy to galvanize action. Whether it was Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, over here a century ago, And often parallels are drawn between that and Rana Plaza, and in many ways justifiably so. Or in other kind of settings, one thinks of what the sinking of the Titanic did for lifeboat safety standards for ocean-going vessels. It is, as I said, sad that we sometimes only learn lessons that are in desperate need of learning when something tragic occurs. But on the positive side of that, today, unquestionably, you've seen tremendous progress in Bangladesh, and to be completely blunt, that does not mean that we are done, right? We've reached a place of that we can declare success. As you know well from your own work and experience, Rochelle, social compliance and social responsibility is not a destination. It's a journey. You don't get to arrive at a spot and say, I'm done. I no longer need to do anything. It's a constant progress and continuous improvement. So there's plenty still need to be done, but let us not conflate that fact that there is still work to be done with the thought that no progress has been made. I think that that is patently wrong to suggest. And anybody who's been observing Bangladesh or been there or done business there, uh, or really the garment industry as a whole, will attest that working conditions in factories throughout the world are considerably better today than they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And that is because of all the work that, companies like yours and mine have done, and all the efforts being put by brands and retailers and manufacturers and obviously workers themselves in better understanding the importance of responsible manufacturing practices and the need to validate them through credible, robust audits. But obviously, of course, the audits themselves don't solve the problem. They merely identify where there are challenges. Action then needs to be taken to ensure that those remediative measures are put in place. And that's where the relationships that you're fostering and engaged in with regards to buyers and manufacturers, with regards to manufacturers and their employees, all play such a central role. And tragedies like Rana Plaza, things that we hope we never have to go through again, um, have galvanized really action in areas that were sorely in need of them. And as I said, we've seen the improvement in Bangladesh, and we've seen the effect that has had on other sourcing destinations. So hopefully that kind of lesson learned translates across supply chains and is not simply one that we see the benefits of in Bangladesh.
That's an excellent point. I love, you bringing to light all of the different players involved, from the manufacturers to the buyers to the government. I remember after the factory collapse happened, a lot of concern from brands wanting to know if factories that they were using were at risk. And my colleague on the ground in Bangladesh told me that he went into some factories and people were painting over cracks in the wall,
Yeah.
because they didn't want to get called out for having a crack that could or could not be a risk issue, which brings up, I think, the idea of some of the things the Alliance and the Accord were trying to accomplish, I think, which was backstopping building owner and factory owner accountability. Just it's a very low margin business. There's not a lot of resources. And I think one of the outcomes of the tragedy was just this call for how do larger players come together in order to make families whole? How do they help restore after a tragedy like this? And that was fairly unprecedented. But I think that I've seen the accord has now expanded. It was renewed. It's expanded to cover Pakistan. So is this a sign that this is an effective approach to bring in companies in like a different role than just social compliance, but also and this was a difference between the alliance didn't focus on that level of liability, but the accord certainly did. Has that been an effective approach?
I think that's a great question, and one that there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that the answer could be yes, although others would maybe say the jury is still out. I think the reality that it brought together so many players and made them see the necessity of not just the value of but the sheer necessity of collective action is undeniable, and in that sense, as I said, both the Accord and the Alliance did some really great work. um, in the end, it is about accountability. That was the word you used, and that's the right word. And one needs to uh, understand that there are multiple ways to skin that cat, and some of that is on the incentive side, and some of that is on the sticks side that will go along with those carrots, including liability, including understanding what the mechanisms for enforcement of such uh, measures would be. Um, the United States, as you know, one of the advantages of having 50 states is that we've got all these different labs we can experiment with laws in. And I know you're familiar with some of the legislation on offer in states like New York or California that is again trying to figure out what joint and or severable liability might look like. And there's a lot of debate going on right now on uh, how that would actually be implemented in a way that is not just effective in terms of being able to take uh, money out of one pocket and give it to those who have been harmed, but it is fair, right? There is a real question as to what to what extent you can hold company A that has been doing business in good faith and all appropriately with everything properly paid for and cared for, um, in a factory that also happens to have another client that isn't as above board. So there's questions there, but the sort of encouraging piece of all this is that the Accord, the Alliance, and subsequent uh, attempts at bringing together a range of players is creating and has established models for platforms where you can have those conversations and are able to explore the right ways forward, because in the end, again, it comes to accountability. And you gave a great example just a moment ago about how some of the initial reactions were to try to paint over cracks, were to try to just essentially circle the wagons and protect yourself from things like that before you know the more appropriate thinking established itself that says, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. If there are cracks, maybe they are cosmetic, but you've got to find out. You can't simply paint over it, right? And you've got to understand that in certain settings, the incentives for painting over are higher than in others. And a low margin business with a lot of time pressure and a lot of competition is precisely that. You said Rana Plaza, the building had 5 garment factories, but also had a bank, right? The folks at the bank were not among the thousands that died because they had been able to say, no, we don't think it's safe here and we're going to leave. They weren't told that they had to go back in, right? So there's a very different reality in certain industries. And so to understand that is important in devising these mechanisms for accountability and liability. And the Accord of the Alliance gave us a couple of models. We've got some legislative uh, sort of drafts that suggest others. It is not a settled question in my mind, but clearly an important one and one that good conversations are being held around, because the one sort of overarching lesson that Rana Plaza kind of taught us, and in many ways the pandemic retaught us or sort of sealed the lesson on, is that we are ultimately dealing with supply chains, right? This is not a two-party transaction. This is not a situation where it's one versus the other. We're all interlinked. We're all interconnected, and we're all going to basically sink or swim together because, as the adage goes, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So we have to understand that attempts to try to find fault or lay blame or push the problem to one end or the other or have it all the burden fall on one actor or another are misguided and are doomed to fail because the supply chain operates as a collective and isn't just the buyer and the manufacturer, but includes the whole ecosystem in which they operate in, society at large, governments, civil society. All these players are involved, and so one has to look at it holistically. One has to look at it collectively and understand that there are roles and responsibilities and along the way for everyone, and everyone should be held accountable for their part. And only then are we truly going to be able to get to the kind of socially responsible and sustainable supply chains that we all want.
That is just such an amazing insight. Thank you for sharing that. And definitely thank you for taking the time to talk to me about this today. I think it's a time of great reflection for us, and to feel like the industry did make an impact provides a lot of hope. And certainly seeing the complexity of supply chains. And like you said, it's not a two-actor issue. There's a lot of different players involved. Hopefully this is a model that is going to be beneficial to all of those involved going forward.
Indeed. I think that's the one message that I really hope takes and sticks. Because, as you know, you've been observing the space for decades yourself, Rochelle. When it first came about, in the wake of Kathy Lee and sort of other exposés back in the mid to late 90s, it got off on the wrong foot. Right? It got off on this whole adversarial setting where you basically had brands and retailers, sort of the buyers on one side, uh, against quote unquote the manufacturers on the other side. As a result, social audits were seen, and unfortunately, many cases continue to be seen by factories as really nothing more than necessary evils. Right? These are just costs we have to endure, and frankly, that naturally in any human being leads to the reaction of how can I minimize the cost, right? It's all about if something is just a pain point, all you want to do is lower the pain, right? Whereas if you are able to think of anything with a price tag attached to it as an investment, in other words, yes, there's a cost, but you are getting a return for it, then you are able to engage in your mind in that cost benefit analysis that says, hey, if the return is more than the cost, then the cost is worth it, even if it's a high cost, right? Which is how we've been able to think about financial audits, for example, as a good exercise in corporate due diligence, as a good health check on the organization, and nobody complains about having to do them because they see value in it. Social audits are likewise very valuable and ought to be seen as such. But because of the way this industry got going, that adversarial setting that pitted and us against them, scenario, we have had to overcome that handicap and are still fighting a bit of an uphill battle in that regard. Once we're able to make that turn, once we get to where factory owners and buyers and retailers as consumers of audit reports see these as investments, right? Then they will say, great, they're worth it because here's the great return we're getting for it. I always draw parallels, you may have heard me say this before, to just going to the doctor, right? If you or I often actually say dentist because that's what I associate with pain. If you think of if you think of that as just a pain thing, then you'll only do it if you absolutely need it, or you won't make a habit of going to the dentist. But it's so much better to actually make it a habit. Go there every 6 months, get a cleaning, get checked up, just stay healthy, so you won't then have to have the pain that would come by neglecting to do that. It's just a matter of which mentality you approach this issue with. Is it a pain and therefore to be avoided, or is it an investment, therefore you bear the cost because the return is worth it?
Oh, absolutely. I think definitely when I go into a factory and they see it as my visit as an opportunity to learn, then I know it's going to go well because no matter what the outcomes are, they're going to be engaging in a positive way and looking for opportunities to improve their whole work environment and the labor conditions for their employees, which just shows that they view all of this as an investment in making a better business. And I feel like when I started in this field 25 years ago, it was definitely rare to find that. But I hope through events like this, through the work that RAP does, certainly in Bangladesh, then we're seeing that change, and we're seeing a lot more value proposition awareness and just an ability to embrace this. Would you say, for your context, for the work that RAP is doing, that there has been that kind of evolution for you in Bangladesh?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mentioned earlier that I feel unequivocally the sort of average factory is a better, safer, more worker-centric place today than it was 20 years ago. And it is because folks have come around to that mental shift that we were just talking about. It takes some time. It isn't always natural in the sense of, a factory starting off that way, but we are at RAP very, blessed to have many factories that come back to us regularly for the reason that you mentioned. They understand the value. They see it as an investment. It is a health check and an opportunity to learn, as you said, that they are willing to take on a regular basis. And so that does help. We still have some educating to do because there's a lot of factories out there that aren't kind of there yet, and new factories come up all the time that are behind on the learning curve, but more and more that learning curve gets steeper and steeper, and we're able to make that transition faster than we had, 2.5 decades ago. But overall, that's the other. I always look for silver linings. The other silver lining of a tragedy of the sort of magnitude of Rana Plaza. As you recall, it was front page news for weeks and months after, and what that really resulted in was just a true increase in the level of attention the issue as a whole got. Responsible supply chains, safe working conditions, right? So that is a terrible way to sort of make something known to the world, but in terms of how many people were exposed to it and how short an amount of time, that was, I guess, the silver lining. It really got to a place where now it wasn't something that anyone in the supply chain would think of as an afterthought, right? You still have players that they're rare, but back when we first got going, it was about price, quality, delivery. That's what mattered to the sourcing folks. And then, oh yeah, we'll send the compliance folks in afterwards to see what's what. Um, After Rana Plaza, that sort of dynamic in some ways was reversed, right? It now became a threshold question of being able to establish that this is a safe place to work, a socially responsible facility, before you can then have the conversation about price, quality, and delivery with regards to the sort of the sourcing folks being able to make that decision. So again, the level of awareness, the level of attention that this has gotten as a result of that tragedy, and thankfully continues to get now 10 years later, is one of the legacies of this sad event.
I think it's important that you emphasize now that it's the starting point. Worker safety is the starting point, and it does make me think. Building safety was never part of the scope of a regular social audit. That requires a level of civil engineering review of a building, for example. But in a way, it was a really relevant risk in Bangladesh, more so than in any other country. And so I just wonder, as that came to the forefront and we realized, wow, this wasn't even in the scope of what people were looking at, but do we have other blind spots? Do you think, have you, as you're looking at the road that we've taken in the last 10 years, where do you want it to head? Or, are there areas that we're still deficient, or things that still need attention as you look to the future?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Rochelle. And to be clear, for our listeners who might have misunderstood, building structural and engineering safety is still not in the scope of a social audit.
Right.
Social auditors have very, very wide skills and are tremendously talented folks and do a lot of work, wear a lot of different hats, but they are not engineers. But they are now very much aware of the need to look at the surroundings, and if they see any kind of signs that suggest there might be structural problems, to flag that, to make sure that there is a assessment done by experts who do understand engineering and building safety and the like. And in high risk jurisdictions, as you indicated, Bangladesh, we make that a requirement. I mean, in addition to a social audit, there has to be a DEA, detailed engineering assessment, that validates the building's structural, fire, and physical safety before we can certify the factory, because it's really kind of ridiculous to say a place is socially responsible as a workplace if it isn't structurally sound as a workplace. So that remains, and points to that larger issue you're raising, which is, what are some other blind spots, and what are some things that social audits are perhaps not designed to address. And it's an important question, because more and more we have come as a sort of industry to be relied upon to do all kinds of things. And I do worry that, and in some ways, the criticism this industry gets is unfair, because the expectation being placed on the work being done is unfair. The idea that you can simply audit a factory into compliance, I mean, that's people know that that's never going to be the case. You have to take the necessary corrective measures following the audit. That's only going to be sort of the information gathering exercise, right? So, but what information can we gather? As I said, the social stuff is where the expertise is, and that's where it should stay. Engineering isn't. Many social audits and social auditors these days are asked to tack on environmental reviews as well, and some of that is naturally an extension and can be achieved to the extent that it involves, validating documents and involves assessing other independently executed exercises like lab tests and sort of water analysis and the like. But some of it is not. You're not going to be doing yourself a favor if you're relying on your social auditor to do a carbon life cycle analysis, or to do any other kind of deep dive environmental stuff that really requires its own expertise, right? You hear often of programs being asked to look at things like some really broad legal issues like land rights and the like as part of a social audit. And once again, I would submit that you can have a certain set of questions asked, but a social auditor's expertise in determining title to land is not something you should expect to be able to rely on, because again, they're not lawyers, they're not real estate attorneys. So there are a range of things that we keep layering onto social audits that I do have some concerns about, because we want to make sure that we are getting credible and viably reliable information, but aren't necessarily equipping the gatherers of that information with the skill sets. So for RAP, for example, we continue to very much believe that the focus is social, and there's, God knows, there's plenty to do in that sphere alone, and we're refining that as we go, more and more. I mean, you know yourself what a social audit looked like. What I guess labor inspection, I guess was what we would call it 25 years ago, looked like, is very different from what it looks like today. It's much more robust, much more detailed, and involves a lot more triangulation and a lot more truly sort of investigative stuff. So let's realize that that's where the skills are, that's where the expertise is, and these other issues are related, are important, but the way we address them is to find experts in those areas and rely on them, rather than expect a social auditor to try to be all things to all people.
Excellent. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And there are so many demands piling up over time, but we have to prioritize what can be done and match it to the right scope and skill set for sure.
Precisely.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me. This has just been really useful to look back on this tragedy and see where we've come. So thank you so much for your time.
It was a real pleasure. Keep up this great work, and thank you again for the invitation to be with you today.
Absolutely. That's a wrap on my discussion with Avedis Seferian from RAP on the last 10 years following the Rana Plaza tragedy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe so you can catch me every week, and check out my feed on Instagram and TikTok for more content. Until next time, have a great week.